And now, please welcome our moderator.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Margot Brandenburg, and I'm Senior Program Officer for Mission Investments at the Ford Foundation in New York City. I'm thrilled to be here to moderate a discussion on the current state and future prospects for our nation's infrastructure. Infrastructure is essential for a thriving society and economy, but U.S. infrastructure has suffered from chronic underinvestment for decades, and recently has come under acute stress from climate change, from COVID, and from the budget crises left in the wake of the pandemic. In 2016, the American Society of Civil Engineers estimated that the U.S. had an unfunded infrastructure gap of $2 trillion. In the 4 years since then, barely a month has gone by without news of the devastating toll from wildfires, hurricanes, flooding, and other weather disasters that threaten our infrastructure and built environment. The pandemic has, of course, added new strain, both from the demands it has placed on infrastructure like broadband and from the massive shortfalls it has left in state and local budgets. New York City, where I live, is ground zero for some of this. Pat Foy has been sounding a four-alarm fire for the finances of our MTA. The education of public school students, like my daughter, is jeopardized by inadequately ventilated buildings and slow Wi-Fi connections. And the state of good repair of our parks and other public spaces are under visible strain when residents need them most. New York is, of course, a comparatively rich city, but I see every day the challenges to quality of life, to racial and economic equity, and to the financial position of our city. Fortunately, a number of smart people are working on these issues, and in a hyper-polarized political climate, infrastructure is often invoked as a bipartisan prerogative. We're extremely fortunate to have on this panel 5 leaders from a range of sectors and geographies who are going to talk about the current state of play and point to some ways forward. I don't have time to do each of them justice, so I'll just introduce them with their current title. I'm fortunate to be joined by Debbie Dingell, U.S. Representative from Michigan's 12th Congressional District. Welcome, Congresswoman Dingell. Catherine Perez, LA City's leader and associate principal at Arup, the global design and engineering firm. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you.
Jonathan Tower, founder and managing partner at Arcturus, a Boston-based impact investing firm. Hey, Jonathan. Philip Washington, CEO of Los Angeles Metropolitan Transportation Authority. Hey, Phil. And Nan Whaley, Mayor of Dayton, Ohio, and incoming president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. We'll never have time to hear all of this panel's brilliance, so I suggest we dive right in and maybe start by picking up on this question of mass transit. Phil, you are the chair of the National Mobility, Recovery, and Restoration Task Force. What will recovery look like for transit systems in LA and around the country?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be on such an esteemed panel. I was honored to chair the National Recovery and Restoration Task Force for the American Public Transportation Association. And the mission of that national task force was really twofold. First, we were looking to develop a path forward for public transportation, preserving the core functions and the financial stability of transit nationwide. And then secondly, we were looking to explore new methods and tools and approaches to reinvent our industry. And one of the things that we put together in that task force was a health and safety commitments program. And the idea behind this health and safety commitments program was to lay out for riders and the public exactly what they could expect from transit agencies and what transit agencies could expect from riders. And some of the commitments that we put forward to our riders was to follow all official health agency guidance, cleaning and disinfectant regiments, providing information and resources to riders, and doing everything possible to keep transit employees safe. We also wanted our riders to commit to some things as well. And some of those included wearing face coverings, maintaining social distance where practicable, and not riding the system when they're sick. And so we have almost 200 transit agencies that have signed on to this health and safety commitments program. They were given toolkits where they could post emblems on their buses, on their trains to show that their particular transit agency, whether it was in the city or rural areas, were committed to joining this effort to convince the public that transit is clean and safe to ride. And the last thing I would say is you mentioned New York, you're in New York. I think that transit agencies are facing an existential threat to the stability of their agencies. And we see this in the dwindling sales tax receipts that are out there. And I would be remiss if I did not call on Congress to provide a second stimulus for transit agencies in this country.
Thank you. Hard work, great innovation at the local level in an extremely, probably unprecedentedly challenging environment. Congresswoman Dingell, you have been a real leader on these issues at the federal level. How can the federal government innovate to accelerate and leverage investment in transportation, clean energy, and other types of infrastructure?
Well, there are a number of things that we need to be doing as we talk about this. And I do agree that we need to be getting a second stimulus done. As we all are talking to you today, at this moment in time, Secretary of Treasury and Nancy Pelosi are talking again. But it doesn't have anything in there about transportation and what we do need to encourage or to ensure that we're doing to protect mass transportation in this country. One of the things that we passed earlier this year in the House was the Moving Forward Act, which was a very broad infrastructure bill, which included a clean energy and sustainability accelerator, which I'm the sponsor of, and I think that it's it's an important tool that we can use to address some of these issues. It's based on legislation that I'd actually introduced earlier and had been included in other legislation that would help us achieve a clean energy economy to meet this existential threat from climate change that we all face. And what it would do is, by taking public financing and stimulating private investment, the private partnerships that all of us have seen work so well in clean renewable energy projects, clean transportation, and support communities most affected by climate change. It would be funded with $20 billion over 6 years, and fully funded could create as many as 5.4 million clean energy jobs. Capital and technical assistance from the accelerator will make more projects economically competitive in more communities nationwide to benefit the investors, the energy consumers, workers, and local economies. We modeled it on something we have here in Michigan that worked, and it mobilizes investment directly into greenhouse gas emissions reduction projects and in need of capital. But but the accelerator will use public capital to stimulate the private investments, and that's really important. This bill isn't going to pass this year because we're at a total stalemate, which I could editorialize on forever. But we also, as we're talking about mass transportation and all of these different issues, there's so many things that we've got to do to convert the transportation system as we know it now, from autonomous vehicles to electric vehicles. California has gone to 100% ZEV mandate by 2035. And we need to make sure we're investing in the technology of the future, that we're staying at the forefront of it. And we need both policies and investments to ensure that we get there.
Congresswoman, thank you, and thank you for fighting the good fight in Congress amidst what must be an incredibly challenging environment. And I want to come back, Jonathan, to you and talk about private investment. But first, I want to go back to the local level and make sure that we're not over-indexing on large metro areas. So I want to turn to you, Mayor Whaley, and ask how, in project planning for transportation and other infrastructure investments, we can take a regional perspective that allows smaller and mid-sized cities to benefit and to have this capacity to innovate.
Yeah, and thank you for having me on. I appreciate this opportunity to talk about something that most mayors from across the country love to discuss, which is infrastructure. It's one of our favorite words. And particularly the message I try to share with folks setting policy for communities across the country. And we hope to someday have a real infrastructure package that comes from Congress. But we also want to make sure that that is a package that is accessible to not just large cities, but to mid-sized and smaller areas as well, places that haven't really been able to compete with the bigger communities that have a lot more leverage. And certainly legacy cities across the Midwest and New York and the Northeast have had challenges with that competition. During the Obama administration, we saw a lot of these competitions or Tiger grants, et cetera, move forward. And there's a challenge with local government because the staffs have been cut so significantly since the Great Recession, as well as just the lack of capacity to really move these projects or be able to compete on a national basis. So really trying to make sure that we're thoughtful about it being, more formulaic based, and also have the flexibility for each community to decide what it really needs. And I definitely think we need to think of complete street models and ways that we change with our transportation sources, but we definitely need to make sure that we give the opportunities for cities like Dayton to be able to fix it first. And that is something that we have not seen for many decades here.
Thank you. Catherine, you have a perspective on these questions that's both broad and deep, particularly for more populous and densely populated regions like Southern California. How do we target infrastructure planning and investment so that it's hyper-local in the way that it responds to people's needs?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in this discussion. I think what has happened is that with COVID, we've become, from a regional landscape to, as you say, a hyper-local experience. We're walking to the grocery store, we're biking to the post office, and we're trying to figure out, particularly in LA, what is a 15 to 20 minute experience. And when we look at the conditions of as Mayor Whaley says, our infrastructure, our local infrastructure, it's very different based on the different neighborhoods we have. And it's very inequitable in terms of the condition of our streets, our sidewalks, our neighborhoods. And I think in this time of kind of rebuilding, because we do need to rebuild our neighborhoods block by block, we need to look at those gaps. And I think what we also need to think about is how we are going to have to engage with constituencies in ways that we didn't before, particularly after the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as all of the issues that have come out of the discussions around race and gender. I mean, a lot of these issues have brought up a lot of inequities. And what we want to do is we kind of come back and take a look at how we can do what I'm calling surgical interventions. How can we, cities and regions, work with our neighborhoods to basically build block by block and working in partnership with community organizations and community groups, because I think that's the best way to address and ameliorate some of these deficiencies that have happened over time.
Again, as a resident of a big city, that really resonates. I know my world has gotten much smaller physically in the past 6 months, and suddenly my block association and our regional planning, our neighborhood planning group is much more salient in my life than in a way that it wasn't before. Thank you. So maybe going back a step, Congresswoman Dingell, you brought up this idea of mobilizing investment, and we have an investor among us. Jonathan, from your perspective, how can governments work with private capital to accelerate investment in these types of infrastructures?
Sure, that's what our firm, Arcturus Impact, does. We're a Boston-based social impact investment firm focused on creating pathways to prosperity for low-income communities, now with experience over 11 years and 6 funds. We've raised more than $175 million of capital for our ESG Impact Opportunity Zone platform, launched in 2019, and recently announced plans to raise a new $250 million fund to continue the same impact investment strategy, very community focused. So if we look at one piece of the infrastructure spectrum, take broadband, focus area for us, it's also an area that has a much greater need. Think about the difference between communities that have resilient infrastructure and lacking infrastructure. Just imagine a map for a second of the United States and highlight all the different areas that have suffered most dearly due to lack of resilient infrastructure. Think about the inner cities, the low-income rural communities that lack broadband, and how they have fared amidst the wreckage of 2020. And now think about the picture specifically relative to how middle and upper income communities have fared during this past year. Do these maps look the same? No, of course they don't. But two maps that do look very similar are the map of communities lacking broadband infrastructure and the number of communities that were designated as opportunity zones. The OZ map and the we don't have broadband map look almost identical. It's a striking correlation. So how can opportunity zones make it right? First off, you might be asking yourself, I've read about opportunity zones in the New York Times, and it doesn't sound too good. Aren't they just a tax break for the wealthy? It was all when they first came out. It was almost like after years of policy development in 2017, Congress finally came out with a way for wealthy people to bend the system their way. And no, that wasn't the intention. It wasn't the goal of opportunity zones. Congress didn't want it. We didn't want it. But our goal here today is really to harness the opportunity zone tax incentive in a way that serves to bring together private investment capital from investors who've realized gains. And yes, of course, that means that they've made money somewhere along the way, along with community development projects that help create pathways to prosperity for low-income individuals. So poor communities that lack this infrastructure, they may be systemically poor. And opportunity zones are one of the ways to reverse these trends and build the infrastructure. The way to do this is to attract OZ equity capital into these projects in partnership with mayors and governors who want broadband infrastructure in their communities. Why don't we see Comcast vans in these communities already? The simple answer is it just doesn't pencil out. They can make more money in putting broadband fiber into other areas. So going into low-income communities is not something that market forces are driving them to do. But we're working on communities that lack broadband throughout the country right now in partnership with the mayors and the governors who want this to happen. The way to do it is to provide either a principal protection subsidy or access to low-income debt financing to engineer these products. At the end of the day, the opportunity zone investors, they're still taking equity risk on these transactions. They have every incentive to make sure that they are good. But by de-risking the overall platform, it's suddenly possible to address these communities where the take rates are expected to be low, income levels are low, and computer literacy is low. Until we make these changes nationally, poor communities will still be left behind. And unfortunately, with 2020, it's grown all that much more severe. The crisis of broadband has very much reflected the crisis of the COVID pandemic. So we see this as one of many tools in the infrastructure quiver that you can use to address the infrastructure gap in broadband.
Jonathan, you didn't mention, I think you told me 96% of Opportunity Zone capital has been for real estate, and the fund you raised is part of that 4% for non-real estate uses. So there's a lot of conversation in the circles I swim in, live in, whatever you do in a circle, about how we can drive more OZ capital outside of real estate. And I'm going to start sending people to you because Arcturus is a pretty fantastic model for how that can be used.
So
I want to...
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I just wanted to pick up on this question of equity, and you've taken us there. For those who are less steeped in these issues than the five of you, can you explain either how infrastructure investments have historically either exacerbated or mitigated racial and income inequality, and how infrastructure can be designed and financed to maximize equitable outcomes? Going back to you, Phil, LA Metro passed an equity platform, and you have, I think, an Office of Civil Rights and Inclusion.
Yes.
How does equity look to you and manifest in LA Metro?
Well, one of the things I always point to is the need for us to look through the lens of equity on anything we do, whether that is projects, programs, anything we do, looking through that lens of equity. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I grew up in public housing, and right across the highway from us was a waste dump. And the public housing was practically built on a waste dump. And we were always concerned. There was breathing problems out there. There was all kinds of ailments, and we suffered. I suffered as a youngster. And so when we start to talk about how these communities of color are being severely impacted in a disproportionate way in these communities, I think this makes it very, very real in terms of infrastructure. And the fact that we should be humanizing infrastructure and letting people know what we're talking about, letting people know in the rural areas, in our cities, exactly what we're talking about when we talk about equity and infrastructure. And so, yes, we have set up that particular office to look at ways that we can make sure that we implement equity in all of our programs. We talk about transit, but I also think about lead-free water. I think about broadband, as was just mentioned. I think about roadway deaths. I think about climate change. I think about electrification of vehicles. There are so many things that we have to do. And I believe that both the public and the private sector, we need resources from both. We need private sector dollars to help finance these great projects. We need the ability and the learning institutions to help people become qualified to do infrastructure work. There's so many things that fall into that bucket of equity. And I think about this question of how do we really want to live? And what does a new city look like when we start talking about infrastructure in these communities? And when I think about how a new city looks, I think that we must have mass transit. There will always be a need to move large amounts of people. When I think about a new city, I think we have to do something about homelessness in our area. We need to do something about affordable housing. All of these things is what I think about when we think about equity and we think about inclusion and we think about infrastructure. So I think much of the social unrest has to do with many things, but I think the lack of good infrastructure in communities is one of them as well.
Thank you. Congresswoman Dingell, I think, sorry, who wanted to jump in?
I just wanted to bring up something, if I could just add, and I want to build on what Jonathan was talking about. I don't think this is systemic. This is structural. This is what we have is a problem that is structurally not equitable or fair. And Phil and I are lucky to be in California and in LA County. We have a lot of great leadership with Mayor Garcetti and Mayor Whaley. I saw you at the last U.S. Conference of Mayors, and I'm very excited about your leadership and kind of having that message for lots of cities around the country. But we're lucky because we've got leaders in the governor's office and here in Los Angeles that are moving us forward toward a green recovery. But one of the things that I wanted to bring up is how we're talking about this, because, I mean, there was an LA Times article where they interviewed an unemployed restaurant worker, and she was a resident in East LA, Boyle Heights, and she said that the word recovery she felt was elitist and in many ways racist, because she felt like I don't even know what that means. And to me, what we need to think about is that when we discuss infrastructure, we need to think about what it means to have the permission to work in these communities. And what I'm saying is that, for some communities, they see and Phil knows this, they see a bike lane coming and they think it's the beginning of gentrification, displacement, and dislocation for themselves. And so to build trust is a much different collaborative model that we've been doing. And I think with this kind of time where COVID has exacerbated structural, historic, generational conditions, as Phil's talked about, I completely know about that. I'm from farm worker families and I know all about these kinds of conditions. And I think that what we need to do is reverse engineer how we discuss the conversation about entering communities and neighborhoods. I think we need to really ask for permission to say, these are the things that we'd like to bring. Do you want them? And if you don't, what can we do to ameliorate the conditions that you live in? Because they know what they need. And I think we need to do a better job of listening to them.
Yeah, building back better for whom? That's sobering and important. I wanted to maybe go back to you, Congresswoman Dingell, because I know equity was also an important part of the Clean Energy Accelerator that you proposed. So this plays out in very different ways at the local level. At that federal level, what can the federal government do to advance equity and infrastructure?
So I want to, for everybody that's watching, a lot of times when we say infrastructure, we think roads, bridges. But here, we need to remind ourselves we do have a lot of the infrastructure in this country is equivalent to a lot of third world countries. But it's not just roads and bridges. It's schools. It's water lines. I mean, we look at the Flint water situation here in Michigan. It's airports. It's broadband. And broadband, as you all were talking about it, it's not only not available in communities of color, but in the rural areas. It's got to be one of our top priorities because broadband is something that levels us all out. And we really have a broadband access issue in this country and around the world. It's about dams. We had a dam that broke here in Michigan, and we saw what happens when you don't invest in that infrastructure. So as we look at the accelerator and we look towards modernizing and investing in robust infrastructure, it would be critical that there'll be infrastructure for all communities, and that it's just not, those that are at the top, so that rural, low income, and frontline communities will be our highest priority if this comes. Not if we will pass. We need to get 15 days, and then we can start to get some other things done. And we also, when we do this, we got to think about the American worker. So the accelerator, as I've written it, would also prioritize project labor agreements and ensuring living wages, prevailing wages. So, we can't forget the pain that so many of these communities are going through, and how do we address them? And they're at the front lines and they're paying the price. And as we try to convert to a green economy, and they're also the economies that have been hurt the most as we talk about it by environmental pollution in the past.
Thank you. And while we're broadening our discussion of infrastructure, I want to make a plug for green infrastructure. I spent 7 years building a company that focused on hurricane and other extreme weather mitigation. And we often think of infrastructure as gray and concrete, and obviously green infrastructure like wetlands and oyster beds can be hugely impactful and cost effective, right? Job creating and all the rest of it. So a couple of you have mentioned broadband. Sorry? Trees, yeah, exactly.
Trees.
Talk about quality of life and climate and job creating nexus. While we're kind of broadening our collective horizons about infrastructure, a couple of you have mentioned broadband. Does anyone want to kind of lob in the case for other types of infrastructure that are underappreciated or typically underinvested in Mayor Whaley, I don't know, for you sitting in Dayton,
Yeah.
like, when you think of infrastructure priorities that are less visible, what comes to mind for you?
Well, certainly broadband's a big issue here in Ohio. We had a law around 10 years ago by the state legislature that took away really cities' rights to do any sort of regulation around that sort of telecom industry work. And so it's made us very, very unequal. And it is basically and effectively a redlining of certain communities around broadband and just overall telecom access. The second thing I would say is, and I know the Congresswoman brought this up, that the issue of sewer and water systems is incredibly expensive and incredibly important. And we recognize, there are needs to work with EPA and find ways to get our systems to be up to snuff, but right now being passed on to those poor community members that can't really afford an exorbitant water system. And in some places, that is then again a barrier too high for these communities. So we really try to make sure that we're talking about quality water as well as water that can be afforded. And that's a huge infrastructure cost that really nobody really talks about because it's been on the backs of the user for so long. But if you can imagine, and we've had these discussions in communities across the country, if we don't get help on that work, you can see an unfortunate situation where poor citizens don't have access to clean water in America. And so I think that infrastructure investment into these utility systems is going to be really, really important to make sure that everyone does have access to quality water. Something that, when you really notice it when you don't have it. And it should not be tolerated, frankly. So that's, I think, a real key infrastructure piece that people don't really think of.
It's pretty galling that clean water is on our list of infrastructure. Sorry, Jonathan, you wanted to get in.
Well, it's Debbie.
Yeah, I was just going to say,
sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, you got it.
Who's talking?
Congresswoman, go ahead,
Congresswoman. Okay, I was glad that Mayor Whaley brought up the water topic here, because wastewater management, fresh water, other forms of infrastructure, they're currently either funded by cities out of appropriations or muni bond offerings or by federal government programs like EDA. And the key thinking here that I'd encourage is not to replace the existing framework, but to think about how mayors and governors can partner with opportunity zone capital or project finance groups to do that work and to hold those assets in private investment funds. The city or the state can still control all the assets. They can design them. They can pick the general contractors. They can set tolling and everything else like that. But the key thing is, once you put those assets into, say, an opportunity zone fund, there's a depreciation tax benefit that would have been wasted on a government owner because they don't pay taxes. But by moving a wastewater treatment facility into an investment fund, at least that fund can use the depreciation tax benefits as a means of reducing the cost of capital to the project. So I think, expanding the idea, broadband is our number one thing, but expanding the idea of the water to annexes to public schools, to fire departments, to public service buildings, things like that is really an important part of the narrative that we'd love to hear more about from community leaders. And I'm sorry,
Congresswoman, please go ahead. The joys of a dynamic conversation with a video delay.
I just want to support what the mayor said. When this COVID epidemic began, we told everybody that one of the most important public health issues was for people to wash their hands. And yet we had people in Detroit and cities across the country that did not have access to running water. We don't realize, I do believe that access to water in this country and in the world should be a human right. And we really don't realize the number of people that didn't. It was my provision in that first care bill, I said to Nancy, I mean, nobody had really thought about it or understood it unless you're a mayor, like the mayor of Dayton, or you're in a city and they're trying to balance budgets, and it's sewer systems and water systems that are sometimes they're run by bonds, sometimes they're private water systems. There are a variety of different finance mechanisms, but we have a crisis that people don't have access to running water. We tried to address that at the beginning and water has been turned on, and in Michigan we got creative and again did public-private partnerships and trying to create funds. But this is the United States of America, and when we have a pandemic, everybody should have access to running water for both public health reasons and sanitary reasons.
So
Amen.
broadband and impassioned, yes, amen is right. An impassioned plea for universal clean drinking water, which I think most of us, if not all of us, agree should be a human right. I heard wastewater. Anyone else want to raise their hand for any other types of infrastructure that might be sort of poorly understood or not typically thought of when talking about infrastructure?
Well, I know that Phil was mentioning, I'll just quickly chime in, the decarbonization effort and transition to electrification is, I think, one of the critical, not only, job opportunities for new training and new skills development, but I think it is the future for many, many cities. And in California, again, we are moving so far in front, and we hope that some of that California thinking and innovation is going to sprinkle in Washington, and we're going to have some folks kind of informing the decisions of decarbonized economy, because that's going to address some of these issues around obviously health disparities. We have so many issues that are tied to our kind of pollution conditions and mobile sources, and certainly in LA, where we've got two large ports, Port of LA and Port of Long Beach. The effort to transition has frankly been accelerated by the state and our local mayors.
I think one other thing I would throw into the conversation mix, and that is the essential workers that are doing much of the heavy lifting in our economy. And in our case here in Southern California, my agency, LA Metro, we carry about 1.2 million people a day on our system. This is pre-COVID. And 70% of our riders are low income. On bus, the annual average income is about $18,000 a year. Those riding on rail, the average annual income is about $28,000 a year. And so these essential workers that rode all through COVID, going to the grocery store, to work in the grocery store, and and hospitals and all of these things. What we have presented, I presented this to my board in August, the idea of making transit free for everyone. I believe, and people, will disagree, not on this call, of course, but, just out there, that transit should be paid for out of the public purse. Like library services, like firefighting services. When we are dealing with such a low-income population who primarily ride our transit all over this country, the idea of a fareless transit system makes a lot of sense to me. Our particular fare box recovery rate is about 13% of our operating costs. So we may be in a better position here in Los Angeles to do this. But when I think about, and we talked about equity earlier, when I think about something like a fareless system, we're really talking about promoting social equity. And we're really talking about expanding economic opportunities. And I could make a case that income, if you take a family of four, for example, if you got two kids, husband and wife, if three of them need or have to buy a monthly pass for $100 each. That's $300 that month. And so if you put that back into the family, that could change and be the difference from that family being in a homeless situation. That could make the difference of affordability for that family. And so I think as we look at infrastructure and we look at the people that really are the foundation of our economy, we should look at how we can provide relief for those that need it most in the infrastructure space. How can we do that? And I can even make an argument that that extra money would come back to us in some way through sales tax, revenue that family might spend on something else. And so I think these are the kinds of things that we should think about in the context of infrastructure. That, and I think the other thing is leadership in infrastructure and the emphasis on implementing these things that we're talking about today.
Right. So I hear you say it was nice for us all to cheer for essential workers at 7 p.m. for some number of months, but actually we need to help them get to their jobs reliably and affordably. My colleagues would add we should pay them a living wage, right? Like, what are the meaningful commitments that we can express through our budget and our decision making to raise up the workers that we now depend on more than ever. I wanted to maybe shift gears, unless anyone else wants to jump in. The delay is a little tricky. And talk about messaging, right? And I heard you guys say, like, we love to talk about infrastructure, particularly for the electeds, where messaging and communication can be so much. Curious about your experiences in talking about this to your constituents, to the broader public. What's compelling? What's difficult to generate support for? How does the public engagement side of this work in your experience? Mayor Whaley, happy to start with you.
Sure.
Or the Congresswoman, sorry.
No, Mayor, go.
I think the key message, while we like to talk about the underlying parts of infrastructure, it's really the parts that affect people every day that I think are effective messages to the community. What's interesting to me about that now is typically that's roads and bridges, and a lot of discussion about roads and bridges or paving. Certainly, as we're a winter state, the issues of potholes are a great entryway into infrastructure and why we need the funding to make sure that we keep on moving around. But what I've noticed, particularly because of COVID, is this discussion of something that is more unseen, which is broadband, and people really understanding the need for it, both for education services to do their job, for telehealth. It's become something, I think, over this past few months that is the equivalent to 100 or so years ago around electricity. So I think that's an exciting opportunity for us, not just in urban centers like my community, but as the Congresswoman mentioned, there are significant issues about infrastructure in rural areas like in Southern Ohio that need to be addressed. And I think people are understanding that those areas are going to be at a significant competitive disadvantage for jobs if they don't get those kind of basis for their communities. And people are really understanding that, and it's a great opportunity to really broaden the conversation about infrastructure. Finally, I'll just say as a rule, like, we talk about infrastructure at Accelerator for America on these panels between mayors to Congress. We use the word infrastructure all the time. It is hardly ever used to community members. We want to be really specific about the work that we're seeing and what that is. And I think that's really important in the messaging of this as well.
Thank you. Congresswoman, you wanted to get in as well.
Well, you need to really understand what the issue is. As the mayor said, when we say infrastructure, it has traditionally meant roads and bridges. And the governor of our state won her election by saying, fix the damn roads.
It's the damn
But,
roads, right?
which we haven't done, just as an aside. The fact of the matter is, this infrastructure discussion that we're having is far broader. I think the mayor is absolutely right when she talks about broadband, because it is such a competitive issue. It gets down to our children and the disparity in our children learning, who's got access to broadband, who's got access to the technology they need, to even the iPads, the computers. It's a real rural communities, communities of color, the low-income communities are the ones that are the most impacted. I also think in like a state like Michigan, which has experienced the Flint water crisis and have seen children literally poisoned by a broken infrastructure system, that people understand the importance of fixing our water pipes, the eliminating lead, replacing very broken and damaged water pipes. But also, as we look to one of the lead sponsors in the House of 100% clean economy by the year 2050. And there are many things we've got to do. We're looking at 2035 as the target year for utilities. And as I said earlier, California's gone to 100% ZEV mandate, which is electric vehicle mandate, for the year 2035. But you have to get to buy those. And why will they buy them? We haven't really talked about the need to build out an electric infrastructure across this country, an electrical charging infrastructure. Right now, we can't get people. Electric vehicles are more expensive. So again, who can afford them? Those who have a higher income. And we've been unable to even get the tax credit extended to make them more affordable. People are very worried about the range and confidence in them because they don't know if they can get it recharged. And we need to be investing in batteries that's got a longer range. And then I want to see us, this is what I think all of us want to do through these various investment programs we're talking about, is creating those jobs here, bringing those jobs back to America, building those batteries here. So there's so many different components and complicated of an infrastructure program. But one, it's, basic human needs like drinking water, sewer needs. People are tired of potholes and bridges. They need to have access to technology, but for the vehicles of the future, we've got to change the electric vehicle infrastructure. We've got to build the electric vehicle infrastructure. And even as we talk about that, and we're having the traditional conversation about, which has been roads and bridges, we fund it through a gas tax, which is going to become obsolete because we're going to lose the internal combustion engine. So there are a lot of things we've got to talk about. You put the human face on it. You talk to people about it in real terms. You talk about how it impacts the personal life and how you want to make sure it creates jobs and keep jobs here.
That's great. I hear you say, speak to people's lived needs, be specific, focus on the job creation, be anchored in the long-term vision for what our infrastructure can and needs to look like, not just next year, but in 20 years. Catherine, you raised before the sort of gets to the infrastructure for whom. Curious, your perspective on how this gets messaged and received by communities that are often the beneficiaries.
Yes, and I appreciate. I think Congresswoman has hit on a lot of kind of the points of putting a face on what we're talking about here. These are real people's lives. The issue is right now, in terms of the public engagement. Arup, the global company I work for, we have offices all over the world, and we're watching and learning from other offices in terms of how the different kind of portions of the globe are responding to the pandemic and how technology has really shifted in terms of the public input, right? So the big issue, and I think we're doing a good job. We could do a better job. The issue is obviously a limiting factor is access to broadband. But I have what we're seeing is a lot more people are able to participate when they have that basic resource of broadband internet. The ability to make the communication as culturally, as linguistically sensitive, so that people feel as if they are able to participate in the language that they feel comfortable in and in a format that they feel is accessible to them. So that is the big challenge, is to make sure that we do have that universal kind of, almost as Mayor said, the electricity of today is broadband, right? So what we need to do is we need to try and make that as available culturally and as, I think, in terms of what's happening at the local level, making sure that we're understanding that these are real people, and understanding also that even what we're finding is that older folks are learning Zoom. So we're finding that some of our folks who are at home are able to patch in, but I do think it's important that we think hard about how we increase our broadband access.
My colleagues who work in broadband are going to be so thrilled that they've been such a center topic of conversation. I can't wait to report to them. Before we turn to our last question, Jonathan, I'm curious, did you want to opine or weigh in on the topic of messaging and communication, or is there something I cut you off inadvertently from saying before?
No, you didn't cut me off at all, but thank you. I think my quick closing remark would be, community leaders don't need to do all of this work themselves. This is a massive economic development undertaking to cover coast to coast of the United States, particularly when you get into the most challenged communities. So the concept of blended financing with government capital and private capital together to deliver a stated outcome is really a timely topic, and figuring out exactly what the communities that we want to have served and what will be the social impact criteria for measuring success is step one and step two in rolling out the carpet to make this happen. Just like the rural utility service in the earlier part of the century brought electricity to all the underserved communities that didn't have electricity, this broadband wave, it's gonna happen, and for good reasons and bad reasons, it's going to disproportionately benefit the communities that adopt it first. So better to be in front of the wave than behind it. So thank you.
Can I add to one thing on messaging and communications? We passed the largest infrastructure measure in this country in LA County in 2016, called Measure M. And we went out and we talked to the clergy. We talked to teachers. We talked to school kids. We were really looking to humanize infrastructure, much of what the Congresswoman and the Mayor were talking about. And we were effective, and we continue to meet with clergy here in LA County on a quarterly basis. The results of that measure, after going out and really humanizing infrastructure, the concept of infrastructure, and talking it up to kids and teachers and the clergy, was the voters approved this infrastructure measure in LA County by a 71% clip. So we can do this. 71% passing a measure at a 71% rate is great. I think anybody would be envious of that. So I think we can humanize infrastructure. We can put it in the terms that people understand, and I think we need to do more of that.
Thank you. That's a great example. And just to be clear, Phil, 71% of voters voted to tax themselves, right? Measure M was the sales
Correct.
Tax
Yes.
measure,
Yeah.
right? That's, even more impressive.
Yeah.
So I wanted to end, if I could, by asking, or rather giving each of you the chance either to talk brass tacks or big vision. And so maybe taking a minute each, I'd love to hear, either the item that's at the top of your wonkiest and most technocratic wish list, particularly as there might be, administrative or other context changes afoot in the coming months, or your kind of bold and succinct statement of your big picture vision. And Phil, you really inspired this, the big picture for how the cities that we inhabit will look, let's say in 2030. Phil, you anchored us with the vision. Anything more you want to say about your vision, or either the top of your, kind of technocratic wish list?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'll point to two things. The first is a question of how do we really want to live? How do we want to live? And in what environment do we want to live? Good infrastructure and all that. So that's the first question. The second thing I think about is bold leadership and real implementation. We have to implement, we have to build what we've been talking about. And we need bold leadership in order to do that. We need a plan. We need the qualified workforce. I was talking to a group not long ago, and I was saying that if we received all the funding that we needed from Congress tomorrow, if manna fell from heaven tomorrow, and we got all the money we needed, I would be concerned that we don't have a qualified workforce to build and rebuild and operate and maintain the infrastructure that we need to do in this country. And so I think we got to get busy doing and get busy implementing the city that we want to see. And the last thing I would say is, we are breaking ground on an infrastructure school here in LA County on this Wednesday of this week. A boarding school concept right in South Los Angeles, in the old site where the rioting went on with Rodney King. A boarding school concept that focuses on kids in the foster care system, kids whose parents have been in the justice system. And so the idea of doing in this infrastructure space becomes very, very important if we want to live in a place that has broadband and lead-free water and all those things.
I love that. Thank you. I'm going to take the bold leadership as a segue to you, Congresswoman Dingell. What's either your sort of best technocratic wish, let's say, for the next Congress, or your biggest, most animating vision?
Well, we've been kicking the can down the road for too long on infrastructure. We've got to broaden our definition of it. As we've talked about today, I think that everything that Phil outlined is a great wish and vision, although I wouldn't count on a manna from heaven and dollars flashing down, even if we do see a change in leadership. But I would look towards a major infrastructure bill, which will invest in all of the things we talked about. And schools are an important part of it. We didn't get into as much detail as we needed to on that. But infrastructure is the foundation of our communities, and we've ignored it for too long. So it's a public good, and if invested in all communities, if treated equally, we give people a better start. We give them a better foundation. We give them a better quality of life. And you heard us all talk about broadband today because COVID has just shown the fractures in our society, and broadband is an equalizer, not just in education, but on the technological front, and what so many people are able to access, from healthcare to even job skills. And he is right that we aren't training people for the jobs of the future. I do dream of that 100% carbon-free society. 2050 is what the United Nations first put as the ultimate target. We've all got to work together, and we got to find a way to put labor at the table so they're part of these discussions, so people aren't worried about their jobs, but we're paying them a fair and a decent wage and creating new jobs, and that they know that they have a strong future in this country. So I guess that's where I'll leave it, since you said a minute and I've already gone over.
Thank you. A blue-green alliance for the century. Thank you.
We need a blue-green alliance.
Amen. Mayor, it looks like we may have lost Mayor Whaley. Mayor, did we lose you? All right. In that case, Catherine, your
I'll
deepest technocratic wish, biggest boldest
I'll
vision.
just be very quick. I want to see an economic recovery that is equitable and just. And I think if we do that, we're going to treat our people well, and we're going to recover all to lift all boats at the same time. And that's what I'm looking forward to. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. In addition to a just recovery, Jonathan, anything else you wanted to put in the category of either your wish list for policy and other bureaucratic possibilities, or your big vision?
Absolutely. For 2020, would love for Congress to embrace the same set of ideals that led to the creation of Ginnie Mae for mortgages, but for infrastructure development, whether it be broadband or public schools in low-income communities, or bridges and roads and things like that. So the key is really to set up a program of direct lending and federally backed loan guarantees that allow these programs to take shape faster without asking the federal government or the states to pick up the entire tab.
Thank you. There's so much more to dive into, but I see that big flashing red countdown clock that's reached 0. So I'll just end by thanking each of you for this rich conversation. I can't wait to dig in more and just feel deeply appreciative of your time. Thank you. I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.